If you believe that you can't standardize your client delivery because each of your clients needs something completely different, then I'm here to tell you today that you're wrong. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can automatically create client tasks in Notion based on the services that they have chosen. For example, let's say you offer services A, B, and C. And let's say client 1 chooses services A and C, while client 2 chooses services B. Based on that, we'll be able to create a set of default tasks for client 1 that would be completely different for the default tasks that are sent to the project for client 2. And what's more, these default tasks or these automated tasks can have all of the due dates, the assignees, and the SOPs related to them automatically. So the first thing I want to walk you through are the required databases that you'll need for this setup to work. And you can see over on Notion, I have them listed out here. So the first thing we have is the services database. And for the services database, you can basically just have a simple list view. And if you like, you can add a tag property here to show the type of service that you're offering, but not much else is needed for now. Then we have the projects database, and for this, alongside any of the other properties you might want, so for example, due dates, having different team members is important. You might want to add a progress bar, but most importantly, we have a relation to our services database here. So you can see I can choose from within this relation any of the other services listed up here. And then finally, we have a task database, our final database that's needed. And again, for this, you might have some default properties like your statuses, your due dates, your assignees. But most importantly, I have a relation to the client project database in this case. So for any of the tasks, I can come in here and assign them to a particular client project database. We can also add this recurring tag here that goes all the way from daily to yearly. And this is for recurring tasks, which I'll show you how to use in a second. If you'd like to grab this exact setup, you can use the link down below in the description to find Notion for Agencies, which has amongst this setup the wiki, meeting notes, content manager, as well as a bunch of other things. So now we have our database set up. The next thing that we need to do is basically decide on the default or the standard list of tasks for each of our different services, projects, retainers, or deliverables. And the best way to do this is to actually use an exercise called process mapping. Now, I won't go into that in this video, but if you want to check out how to process map, you can use the links here or here. But essentially what this exercise allows you to do is work with your team to visually map out all the different steps within a given process so that you can know how to do it best, how to automate some of it, and most importantly, how you can know the steps to then automate the tasks that get generated for the projects. But once you do know what those steps are, I recommend that you actually document them within each of the services pages just by simply adding a to-do and adding the tasks in here. So for example, for social media, it might be get access to client accounts. It might be decide on overall writing voice. Any steps that are for this social media service, I can list down below here so everyone knows what they are. So now I've got my databases and I've decided on what the task should be. The next thing to do is to actually create the automations. And we're going to be using Notion's database automations here. And they are actually going to be assigned to the projects database. So you can see here at the project database, we have this Thunderbolt emoji, which allows us to access the database automations. And I already have some automations in here. So for example, I have an overall onboarding automation that all of the projects will get automatically. And so what happens here is when any of the statuses of any of the records inside of client projects get set to onboard, what we are doing is we are adding a task or adding a record to our task database. And then we are deciding what the fields are, what the properties are. So we are saying the task name for this particular example is prep for onboarding call. We are then taking the relation to the client project and assigning it to the trigger page. So whichever project was assigned to was set to onboard, we are then assigning this task to that project. We are saying who the assignee is and we're saying who the due date is. So this is essentially how this works. And what we'll eventually have is one general onboarding automation for any project that has become active, but then also we'll have a dedicated database automation for each of your service lines or projects or deliverables. So for example, we have a website redesign one here, and essentially when the service contains website redesign, and it should also say, and the status is set to onboarding, then we are going to do a list of tasks that are unique to this service. So that is the overview of it, but let's actually create one together in real time so you can see what this looks like. And we'll do it for that social media service that we scoped out. So again, I'm going to hit the Thunderbolt here and choose new automation. This will open up our automation menu. And for this is our social media tasks. And so the first thing it's asking us is this for all pages in our client projects database, so the entire database, or is it for a specific view? I want it to be for all views, so that's fine. And then the triggers that we're going to have is, again, first of all, I'm going to say that the service contains, and I want social media. So that's the first trigger. And then I can also add a second trigger here, and it's asking me if I want it to be applied to, if the trigger should trigger when all of these variations occur. And that is correct, so I want all. And then the next trigger I'm going to add is the status is set to onboard, and hit done. And the reason I do that is because over on the client projects database, we have these statuses. And essentially, because we need to basically set some of the properties inside of the projects database for the automation to work correctly, what we have is this planning status first. So what we can do is basically create a new project and for it to be set to planning. And then only once we've added all of our properties in the projects database, which is going to dictate some of the properties that get created in the task database, only once we're ready, then we can move over to onboard, and then that will trigger the automation. So that's why we choose the status to be set to onboard. If we was to just choose the trigger, for example, of page added, it would mean we wouldn't get the opportunity to actually set the properties in the projects database that again dictate some of the tasks that are created. So we've got our triggers, so now it's time to add our actions. And as we showed in the example, what we essentially do is we add a page to, and from our select databases option, we're going to find our task database. So we're basically adding a task to the task database. And then before I actually add what that task is going to be in the task name property, I'm going to edit another property. And the most important thing that I do is make sure that this particular task is related to the client project of the trigger page. So now we have that trigger page relation. The next thing we can do is actually say what the task is. So I think we said get access to client accounts. Now, the next thing we can do is basically add any other properties that we want to be filled in automatically for us. So the first thing we can do is actually decide who the assignee is going to be. And this is something that I love about Notion. We can actually create dynamic assignees based on who the assignees are in the project. So for example, get access to client accounts would probably be the responsibility of whoever is the client lead on this particular account. So what I can do is, instead of actually just choosing a standard assignee every single time this automation occurs, I can now use Notion's custom formula option. So if I hit custom formula, essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the trigger page. So again, the page that is triggered by this automation, the project. Then I'm going to do the dot icon, and then I can choose from within the trigger page, I can find all of the properties. And I want to basically have this assignee be our client lead, which is this property here, a rollup property. And I can save that here. And so now basically whoever the client lead is for this account is going to be assigned this task. The next thing that I can now do is choose the due date. And again, with Notion's custom formula, I can now make dynamic due dates based on whenever the trigger date is. So for example, instead of just saying, let's say, instead of just picking a date for whenever that might be, obviously our projects will happen at any time into the future, so that's not going to work. What I could first do is basically say, make the due date the date that this automation is triggered. So whenever that project has moved over to onboard, then give it the due date of that date. So that works. Or what I could do is, let's say I want this to happen in the future. So I want the person to get access to the client accounts, let's say 3 days after we start the project. What I can now do is have a custom formula, choose the date triggered option. So we have date triggered. Then I can do the dot property, or actually what I'm going to do is come over to the start of the formula and choose the date add function. And then within the date add function, I'm going to say I want to apply 3, and then I'm putting days here, and then I'm closing out this formula. And so basically now the due date that's going to be applied is whenever the status, the project has moved into on board, whatever time or whatever date that happens, I'm then going to add 3 days on top of that, and that is the due date that is going to get decided. So that's good for me. But one thing you might be asking is, we might move the project into the onboard phase, not on the actual start date of the project. So what you can actually do is create another date property. So we know what the due date is. We could also create another property called start date. And so we can basically say, we can actually define when this project officially started. So now we have this start date. Over on our automation, we can actually update this and basically say, we want this due date to be added 3 days from the start date. So we'll do trigger page, find the properties using that dot icon, and come over to start date and hit save. So now basically the due date is going to be dictated by whatever that start date is plus 3 days. Going furthermore with the due dates, what we can also say is, let's say you don't decide the due date typically from when the start happens, but actually you decide when the task should happen from when the project is due. So what we can do in this instance is, instead of saying date add, we can replace this with date subtract. And then instead of saying the start date, we can say the due date. So now we can have this task be triggered. Let's say it's 10 days from the due date. So let's say typically we have shorter projects that are around 14 days to complete. So we might set this due date from 14 days time. Then based on that, this task is going to be created with the due date from 10 days from when the actual project is finally due. So we know that we're doing all of our tasks within the amount of time that we need to do them to actually complete the entire project. The next thing that a task should have, as well as the assigning the due date, is how the person can actually complete the task. And to do this, we can actually bring in another relation we have to another database, which is our SOPs database. So we have this related SOP relation. And so now from within here, we can browse our entire SOP database. We don't actually have an SOP that says how to get access to client accounts, but let's pretend that this SOP is. And so now the task is going to be generated with this SOP. So the person knows who's been assigned it, they know when they need to do it, and now with the SOP, they know how exactly to do it as well. So that looks good for me for now. And we did have a second task. So the way that we can actually create the second task a bit quicker this time is just use these 3 dots here and to hit duplicate. And now we've duplicated this task and we can just edit the contents. So I think the next task was decide the writing style. We can keep the trigger page the same. The assignee, let's say this time it's not the client lead, it's actually editor that would be in charge of this particular job. And for the due date, let's say we want this to happen 8 days away from the due date. And then the SOP, let's choose another SOP here. Let's choose this script for leads here. And now we've got these 2 tasks coming in automatically. So just to make sure this works, let's run a test. I'm going to use this ABC project here. I'm going to make sure that I've applied all of the different properties that I need for this to work. So the first one would be applying the services to social media, making sure I've got a client lead, and also making sure that I've got an editor. Let's make John our editor. And then also making sure that I've got a due date, which is December 12th. That's actually in the past. So let's put this for January the 3rd. And now once I'm ready, I can move this status over to on board, and hopefully the automation will run. So here we go. We can see inside of ABC Co, we have within the tasks the get access to client accounts and decide the writing style. It's been assigned to the people based on who the actual team is for this exact project. So that's great. We have the due dates coming in based on the ultimate final due date of this project. So we need to make sure we get the access account by December 24th and decide the writing style before December 26th. And then also we have the related SOPs, so we can click into there and see exactly how we're meant to complete these tasks. Now, what we can also do is make one of these tasks a recurring tasks using our recurring tags feature. So let's say, for example, we had another task here and we are wanting to post the social media content, and obviously this would have to happen every single week as part of our retainer contract. So now what we can do is we can leave everything the same. Let's say this happens with the same person, same SOP, but now what we can do is add this recurring tag, and we want this to happen on a weekly basis. And so basically the task is going to be created, and then it's going to be given that due date, which is based on the ultimate due date of the project. And then once that's marked off as done, that's then going to trigger another automation, which is an automation that is native to our task database. And then now this is going to be create a new task, the same task, but set for a week in advance. So we can now have a recurring task happening every week for this particular retainer project. If you want to learn how to set up that recurring task feature, watch this video here or here. But what this now basically allows you to do is have all of your tasks being created based on the services, and also for your retainer projects, you can have recurring tasks being set and recurring each time you need to do them. So I've implemented automated tasks for almost all of my clients, as it's one of the most powerful ways that you can start to standardize agencies as well as full service agencies that have a lot of custom work. But there are some best practices that I want to walk you through now to help you maintain and keep your automations running and working well. And the first one is to actually make sure that you delegate the task of setting up each of the projects and moving them into that onboard phase to trigger the automation to one person in your team. This will typically be your project manager, but essentially they should be someone that understands how Notion works. They should also be in charge of the automations themselves and setting them up and customizing them. And so basically, that person is the person creating the projects, triggering the automations, and then also going through and customizing the tasks if needed. So for example, when these two tasks came into ABC Co, there's some variables that have been defined for me, but I as the project manager might actually say, actually we need this to happen a little bit sooner because someone might be out of office, and actually John can't do this because he's currently unavailable, so I'm going to move this onto my plate. So it's very important, once the automations have been triggered, you have a project manager going over each of the tasks and making sure that they are correct and changing them if they're needed. The second hurdle I see with automations is agency owners allow them to become outdated too quickly. And as soon as the automations have tasks in there that no one is no longer doing or need to be doing, then people stop trusting the software and stop trusting Notion as the single source of truth. So a recommendation I have here is to actually use the services database to only document what tasks are inside the automation, but allow other people on the team to recommend new tasks and use the commenting section to keep track of that. So as an example, when we look at the social media section, we have these two tasks that are living inside of the automation. But what we could have is, let's say there's someone else on the team that isn't in charge of the automations and doesn't know how they work. If they wanted to add a new task, they could come in here and say, please, and at the person, so let's say it's John that's in charge of the tasks, can you add a task, post social media content? And then they can also say with due date of, and then also with SOP assigned to, and they can basically script out or scope out what should be in the tasks just in this comment section here. Then they can post that comment to the person who's in charge, and then John can see this, basically do that in the automation, but also log the fact that it lives in here. So add this task in here. And then finally, they can just reply to Sam and say, that's been done, and also resolve this comment here. So now it's moved out of the way. And so this is how you can easily maintain the tasks in the automation without having to have everyone on the team understand how the automation actually works. Of course, task creation is just one piece of the systems puzzle. In order to truly take charge of your operations and unlock scalability, you'll need to understand what else is needed. So check out my How to Systemize Your Agency mini course with the playlist here or here. If you'd like to see more of these kind of videos, please leave a comment down below and consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bye-bye.